Now, joining me on the line to discuss this is Charlotte Chase, who's a member of the Conservative think tank, the Bow Group, and Josh White, who's Associate Editor at Sukion magazine. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Charlotte, can I just start by asking you, the simple truth is that the Theresa May government is as divided over Europe as prior to the referendum, between those who want a hard Brexit and a soft Brexit. And we've seen cabinet ministers leaking and telling on each other ever since May became Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, that was an inevitable consequence of the Brexit vote. The Cabinet is as divided as the British public is indeed over Brexit, and that is reflected in this debate that we see between hard and soft Brexit. I believe that this is somewhat necessary, this divide. It's ultimately going to result, hopefully, in the best outcome for Brexit. We're going to create a deal, hopefully, with Europe and with our other trading partners and the rest of the world that represents both the best interests of Brexiteers and the best interest of Remainers. And ultimately, it's this combination that's going to lead to the best outcome for the United Kingdom.
I mean, Josh, no one seemed to have a plan B in the event of a vote to leave the European Union. And since then, it seems as if we've just been writing it down in the back of a cigarette packet ever since. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree with that. And the whole point of this administration is to manage a transition. But what that transition looks like hasn't really been considered up until quite recently. And I think it could either make or break the new administration. In many ways, Brexit is the greatest test any PM could face. It broke her predecessor, and the European question has been poisoned for many Tory leaders, going back as far as Ted Heath.
And Charlotte, coming back to you as well, I mean, today she met with the heads of the devolved governments across the UK. Nicola Sturgeon from Scotland seemed particularly angry after that meeting. The Scottish government, are determined to keep in the single European market. That is not going to be very easy to accommodate for Theresa May, is it?
No, and I mean, had we had a Brexiteer become Prime Minister, I think we would be looking at a very different situation. May has asserted her desire to keep the union together, and I think ultimately at this stage of negotiations, that is the best option for Britain as a whole. It is a very single-minded attitude of Scotland to want to use the Brexit referendum divisively as a call for another independence referendum.
They did vote to stay in the European Union, though, Scotland.
They did indeed, but they also voted to stay part of the UK as a whole. So that both those results do have consequences for Scotland. I believe the UK will be better off having voted to leave the European Union, as will Scotland independently. So I think that May ultimately made the right call in cementing the union with these talks today.
I mean, Josh, how do you see it? Because, I mean, to leave the European Union and potentially have the United Kingdom fall apart, that would be a bit of a disaster for any Conservative government.
Yeah, that would be a major disaster. It would be a historic crisis for the Conservative Party and for this government. I think the UK could well come apart under this government and possibly the next, depending on the timeline. I mean, it's clear the SNP see a split between the interests of the Scottish people and the rest of the UK, or at least the English. And that seems to be reflected in the voting patterns.
Now, Charlotte, there's been an attempt to put clear blue water between the Theresa May administration and the David Cameron administration. One of that was the announcement of these new grammar schools. Theresa May proudly saying that she was a grammar school girl, in contrast, of course, to David Cameron, who went to Eton. But since then, that policy has met with a wall of opposition, not least inside the Conservative Party. Doesn't it suggest to you it's a dead duck?
I don't think so. I think there's great merit to the reintroduction of grammar schools. It gives ultimately what Theresa May stated she wanted to do at the start of her premiership, the opportunity for a fairer Britain. Currently, we have an education system that's out of reach of the large portion of the working class and the middle class in our private school system. And grammar schools make that more achievable. It also seeks to improve the quality of our education system as a whole in this country. State schools can learn considerably for the strategies put in place in grammar schools. So I think it's a fantastic scheme that has set this administration apart, but it's hopefully to the benefit of the education system in this country.
Well, Josh, I mean, we got rid of grammar schools back in the 1960s because they were not benefiting the majority of pupils in this country. And comprehensive education saw, after its introduction, an improvement in the educational system, did it not?
I think you can make that argument. It's also worth bearing in mind that we do have selection in terms of house prices, where if you have to get a mortgage to get your kid into the right school, then that school is effectively charging a fee. So we have selection in that form. But the argument for grammar schools, that's just another layer of selection. And I think ultimately it would make things far worse.
Now, Charlotte, turning to you again, isn't there a contradiction in Philip Hammond, who's trying to say, I want to put the interests of the City of London and, to an extent, industry first, and Theresa May, who seems to be saying that the key thing is more immigration controls?
I mean, yes, on the surface there is a clear distinction between those two rhetorics. I think what Philip Hammond is trying to do, and successfully to an extent doing so far, is distancing himself from the political rhetoric. He is Chancellor of the Exchequer. His job solely is to look after the economy. I think one of the downfalls of George Osborne was the fact that he was too involved with the political machine in Westminster and then wasn't able to use his position as successfully as Philip Hammond hopefully will be able to do so. Looking after the interests of the City of London and the wider economic interests of the UK does sit apart from the other slightly more political areas of policy. Ensuring the interest of the banks in the City of London and that the economy is strengthened now post-Brexit is a highly important job, along with coupling the political interest that May is providing. Those need to come together from two separate entities, whereas before they were incredibly murky waters.
And Josh, can I just ask you a final question? It always seems that the City of London's interests come out on top of everything else. Yeah,
I think that's quite right. Certainly since at least the Big Bang in the 80s. The problem now is that the Tories find themselves in a situation they need a strong industrial base, but they've basically deindustrialised the country and they've centralised the economy around banking. It's quite an ironic situation in a way.
And that's all the time we have for in this episode of The Report. I want to thank both my guests and all my guests on today's show.